Good afternoon, and welcome to the third and final instalment of our webinar series on modern monetary theory. In our first webinar, Professor Bill Mitchell, one of the founders and leading advocates of MMT, explored the basic principles of the theory and addressed some of the myths surrounding it. In our second webinar, Dr. Lacey Hunt outlined the longer-term risks of MMT, including hyperinflation and the triggering of Gresham's law, or the idea that bad money can drive out good money. In this webinar, Matthew Peter will weigh up both sides of the MMT debate and present a balanced view of the theory. We are very fortunate to have Matthew with us today. Matthew is Chief Economist of QIC, one of Australia's largest institutional funds managers, where he oversees global economic forecasting and research. Matthew previously worked with fund manager TGM, where he headed the economic and financial market forecasting team. Prior to joining TGM, Matthew was Senior Research Fellow at Monash University. Here, he led the development of a regional model of the Australian economy. This model is widely used by federal and state government agencies and by most large consultancy firms. Matthew and his team are among Australia's top forecasters as ranked by Bloomberg. He is President of the Queensland Economic and Finance Council, a CEDA trustee and member of the QUT School of Economics and Finance Advisory Committee, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service Finance and Audit Committee. Matthew is a frequent commentator in the press and at industry forums, and has 20 years of economic modelling experience in both industry and academia. Matthew also holds a PhD in economics from Monash University. Welcome, Matthew. We're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction, and also thanks to you and to BDO for inviting me to speak today at what's a really fascinating topic. Before I get started, I would just like to point out the role that the Australian academics have played in developing the modern monetary theory, in particular Professor Mitchell, who spoke on the very first seminar. I mean, Bill Mitchell is really credited with coining the phrase modern monetary theory, which is now debated intensely around the world by governments, financial market players, academics. So the fact that we have actually been at the forefront of a new theory, regardless of how you view that theory, and we have an academic here who was one of the originators, is a fantastic, I think, narrative for Australian economics. So I'd just like to first congratulate Professor Mitchell for that achievement. Look, I'm going to try and give a balanced view. I'm not an expert like Professor Mitchell or Dr. Lacey. I'm Dr. Lacey from the States, who spoke to you before. Really, I suppose I'm a business economist, and I do financial market analysis insofar as I'm looking out to longer run and shorter term impacts of variations in the economy on asset valuations, for example. So MMT has really been a theory that's sort of sat in the background for much of its life. It hasn't really come to the attention of financial markets. Its first sort of appearance noticeably was after the GFC, where people were looking for alternative paradigms to the existing paradigm. But it really got its strong pickup in attention following its adoption or its championing by progressive Democrats in the US Congress. And so it's really a more recently profiled theory. So typically business economists like myself haven't had a long time really studying MMT, although we're catching up quick now as it becomes more popular. So if I could just go to the next page. So what I want to talk to is a couple of points. I want to start off with really just what is MMT and what it isn't, or in particularly, how does it work? Second, I'll pass on to then what does it claim. I then want to have a quick look at some back of the envelope statistics, for want of a better word, that I've done about the evidence, and also look at what the experts are saying. I then want to talk to you about what I really don't understand about it, and then finally I'll weigh it up, in other words, the balance. So I'll go on to this first topic, what is it and how does it work? So if I could just go to the next slide, thanks. Well, look, one thing I noticed in both Professor Mitchell's, in both previous presentations, is I didn't really find that there was a definition provided of what MMT really is. So that's what I'm going to try and do firstly, is try and define what it is. And it's difficult because it's a very broad theory of the world, but I want to hone on the key features that people are really discussing at the moment. The key features are that governments that issue their own currency, that is money, they can't go insolvent, as they can always issue currency to pay off their debt, as long as the debt is denominated in their own currency. And that was the idea that they can just get the central bank to print money or issue currency, as the MMTs like to say, in order to pay for any expenditures. Now, government deficits can be used to create productive activity, and they can be funded by the issuance of currency on behalf by the central bank. The government need never repay the central bank, or alternatively, the central bank can extend the government credit indefinitely by financing the debt with additional money issuance. So in essence, debt's not an issue for the government. It can effectively get the central bank to just print money in order to pay for its expenditure, and it's through that mechanism that the government can actually do as much expenditure or as little expenditure as it wants, and isn't really constrained by debt at all. So next slide, please. What are some of the implications of the theory according to the MMT as well? The limitation to government spending, turns out, is not the debt, because it can always be met. It can always meet its debt obligation by issuing more money. Rather, the limitation on government spending is when that spending causes an imbalance in supply and demand in the market for goods and services, and that, particularly when that imbalance causes demand in the economy to exceed its productive capacity, resulting in inflation. So it's really the problem of inflation that limits the extent to which governments can run deficits. Now, the MMT's response to a situation where inflation arises is that that is when inflation, and then there's a question about what does an excess level of inflation really mean for the MMTs, and it's an inflation level that exceeds a level that's consistent with full employment. Then what the government can do, as it controls spending, it just controls the demand in the economy, reduces demand in the economy, and hence inflation, by reducing the deficit. So easing fiscal policy. So why do they say that that's a good thing to do? They argue that easing fiscal policy is far more effective than lowering interest rates in stimulating an economy when there's excess productive capacity, or when you're in a slowdown or recession. Whereas tightening fiscal policy is far more effective than raising interest rates in controlling inflation when there's excess demand. So it's that the other key point of the MMT is that it's far more effective than monetary policy, conventional monetary policy of raising and lowering interest rates. Next slide, please. Now, this next bit that I want to take you through is it's going to be a little bit demanding on your attention, I'm afraid. What I'm trying to do here is really give you an exposition of how MMT works in the sense of how the MMTers think about it. Now, the reason I'm doing that is so that, you know, we can get behind why the MMTers, the proponents of MMT, think the way they do and how they come up with their conclusions, but also to see if we can, you know, contrast current policy and to see if it looks like anything like MMT. So one of the issues in markets at the moment is that, you know, central bank governments and central banks are really doing MMT by stealth. That is, the central banks are funding government deficits simply by their purchase of government bonds through quantitative easing programs. So that's sort of like a coordinated policy. But this example is designed to show how fiscal and monetary policy coordinates in an MMT world and how it leads to stimulating demand and production, and how it leads to actually increasing the money supply without increasing debt. So this is the famous F-35 jet fighter example that the MMT gives themselves, and it starts off in that very top box with the government wanting to buy an F-35 jet fighter from Lockheed, which costs $100 million. So according to the MMTers, what starts the ball rolling in their world, in their preferred world, is that the government issues the central bank with $100 million, in the case of American Treasury bill. The central bank deposits that's like an IOU to the central bank. The central bank deposits that money into the account of the central bank that they hold with that the government holds with the central bank, and then it takes that and deposits that money and deposits it in Lockheed's $100 million. It deposits it in Lockheed's bank of $100 million. It deposits that in that Lockheed's bank's account with the central bank, and then Lockheed's bank, that is, it draws down that $100 million that the central bank has deposited in its account with Lockheed. It draws that down and it deposits it into Lockheed's account, the account that Lockheed holds with the Lockheed's bank. And then Lockheed has a deposit there. It's got an asset, a payment, in other words, from the central bank, and then it supplies the government with the F-35 fighter plane. So where does that all leave us in the wash? Well, on the next slide, the bottom line is the government got its jet fighter, so it got its asset. Lockheed created the fighter. It employed workers. It bought supplies from other businesses, and it got paid. It got paid by the central bank via the government. The government racked up a debt with the central bank for $100 million. That was the original Treasury bill that it issued to the central bank. But, and here's where the big but is, it turns out in the MMTers world, the central bank never has to pay, never needs to be paid, I should say, by the government. The government never has to actually make good on that Treasury bill to the central bank, and neither does it have to pay interest if it doesn't want to on that bill to the central bank. Why? Because it doesn't have to in the MMTers world. I mean, this is just a money transaction. Effectively, the central bank has printed money or issued money, just created money, $100 million. The fact that there's a promissory note from the Treasury in the form of a T-bill doesn't really matter, because they never have to redeem it. They just roll it over. That's the basic connection there between the central bank and the government. So the central bank actually is just a conduit for implementing government fiscal policy in this world. And of course, there's no debt, but there's certainly this asset that's been created. What's happened to the money supply? Well, the money supply, which is notes and coins and deposits with the commercial banks, that's what defines the most predominant, most basic level of the money supply. Well, that actually increases by $100 million. That is, Lockheed's got a $100 million additional deposit that it previously didn't exist. So the central bank has actually increased the money supply through this process, through the issuing the deposit to Lockheed. Now, one question that I'd like to ask, and I'd like to go back to this diagram, if I may, on the previous slide, just quickly to say, look, what happens if the government decides to actually offset the expenditure with a tax increase to keep the balanced budget? Well, the government would simply issue a tax bill to Lockheed of $100 million. Lockheed would have to draw down its deposit of $100 million to pay the government, which it would do by instructing Lockheed's bank to draw down their account and pay it into the central bank's account. And the central bank would then have a $100 million asset set against the $100 million liability of the original Treasury bill. So there would be no change in the account with the central bank. There'd be no notional even creation of debt. But Lockheed, once they reduce their deposit of $100 million, they're still committed to supplying the plane to the government, would have to presumably then seek to economise elsewhere. They wouldn't be able to supply the plane to the government and also supply planes to other people. So that's the sense in which that type of funding crowds out expenditure, according to MMT. What about if they issue bonds? Well, if they issue bonds, if the government issues bonds again, Lockheed would use their $100 million deposit that they got to buy the bond. They'd instruct the Lockheed Bank to pay the central bank for the bond, and the central bank would now have $100 million to offset the original Treasury bill issuance. Again, you'd have no rise in you'd have debt funding, but Lockheed wouldn't have the original $100 million, and they'd have to economise again. That's the sense in which it crowds out. And finally, what happens if then, after that effect, the government instructs the central bank to actually buy the bond off Lockheed? So the central bank is instructed to buy the bond. It prints money to buy the bond off Lockheed. Lockheed transitions the bond, sells the bond. It's now got $100 million back in its deposit account. It gives the money to the central bank, and the money supply again is increased by $100 million. And Lockheed doesn't have to economise on the supply of F-35s, and the government's got its F-35, which stimulated the economy. That, to me, what I've just described last is what's happening at the moment, in my opinion, with quantitative easing, effectively funding government spending. Anyway, I'll press on. If I could go across to the next slide, which is what does MMT claim? I think I'm looking at slide 6. So what's the bottom line? Well, as I said, the bottom line is the government's got its jet fighter. Lockheed created the fighter, employed workers, bought supplies from other businesses, got paid. The government racked up a debt with the central bank of $100 million, but the central bank never has to really be paid. Of course, it doesn't have to. The money supply, notes and coins, increases by $100 million. That's Lockheed's deposit. What is the government paid for? What if the government paid for the F-35 by issuing bonds to the private sector and then instructed the central bank to purchase them? That was my last example. In my view, it gives an outcome that's very close in terms of the result you know, to the MMT as a result. In fact, a lot of MMTers argue that the type of QE that's been undertaken at the moment is very similar to their system when interest rates are close to zero. So, what are people worried about? Why is there a problem with this approach? And why are people? Another way of asking the same question: why are people at the moment worried about the way in which central banks are conducting monetary policy by effectively funding government deficits through QE programs? Well, the first issue is debt. Isn't increasing levels of debt a problem? And you saw the last speaker really centre on this issue as a problem. What MMTs would say is there's no problem because the central bank can just forgive the debt that it holds or continue to create money to pay for and service the bonds purchased in secondary markets from the private sector. There's no constraint. The rejoin to that, well, if we keep on funding deficits and the deficit gets bigger and bigger and the money supply keeps on increasing and demand keeps on increasing, eventually doesn't that lead to inflation? Well, what MMTs say, well, you know, sure, it would, but that's not a problem and there won't be inflation as long as the demand for goods and services is less than the economy's capacity to produce, because it's this demand-supply imbalance that creates inflation, not just a monetary phenomenon per se. If the fiscal stimulus eventually drives demand in excess of productive capacity, in other words, demand exceeds supply, leading to inflation, then the government can control inflation by tightening fiscal policy. That is, it raises taxes or cuts back on spending. Question is, why do it? Well, the MMTs would argue that monetary policy implemented by central banks, the conventional monetary policy, which just involves lowering and raising interest rates, is really ineffectual in stimulating the economy, particularly in situations where there's excess capacity. So the argument is interest rates go down, it's meant to stimulate businesses to increase investment expenditure, but in a recession, businesses are taking a premium on how much they have to earn in order to invest, and the lower interest rates can't get low enough to really get them over the hurdle rate of investment. And we see that a lot in financial markets at the moment. One phenomenon that we've seen in financial markets since the GFC is a widening in the spread between yields on assets and required investment levels and the real interest rate in the economy. The other tenet is that fiscal policy of the Treasury is far more effective in stimulating the economy when the economy is in recession or is in a slow growth environment. They argue that, as Professor Mitchell did in the first presentation, that the decade post-GFC obviously shows that monetary policy doesn't work. It hasn't really been able to deliver strong growth. It hasn't been able to lift inflation. It's clear that fiscal policy was doing a better job, because as soon as the mistake that was made of bringing fiscal policy back, or austerity as it was called, stopping the large increments to fiscal policy, had a negative effect on both growth, inflation, and unemployment rate in the economy. So why you want to do MMT? Because it focuses on fiscal policy, which is far more effective in controlling the economy, has been a stabiliser to getting us out of slowdowns than what monetary policy is through central banks raising and lowering interest rates. So as a nutshell, that's how I see the debate at the moment. So there's a couple of issues that arise from this, in my opinion. Firstly, when I look through the debate, there's a real paucity of empirical evidence for these claims, and particularly by the MMTers. Now, is that a bad thing? Is that a problem with the MMTs? I don't think it is. The MMT is largely a theorist. It's their job to posit new theory given their observations of the world, and they're trying to best evolve theory so that it explains in the most clear way, with the minimum of assumptions. It's able to explain phenomena that we see in the real world. it's actually empirical economists' job to be applied economists to actually test these theories. Now, the question is why isn't there more empirical evidence to test the theories of MMT? Well, partly because there's no real experiment with MMT to test. Secondly, it's very difficult to test these propositions in the economy with so many things moving at once to isolate whether monetary policy is weak at stimulating the economy or fiscal policy is better. That's difficult to actually show in an uncontrolled experiment. Nonetheless, that sort of problem has never stopped me from just being like a man on the street and asking the question, well, look, I would have thought, I suppose, if fiscal policy was so powerful at regulating the economy, at moving growth and the unemployment rate in ways that are counter-cyclical, maybe over a lengthy period of time, I'd expect to see some relationship between perhaps size of the deficit and the level of the unemployment rate. So what I did, if we turn over to the next slide, is I just did a really simple test, at least of correlation. And you can see that this is plotting that plot on the graph that you're looking at the moment. It's just plotting the government, US, this is in the US because the MMT is really concentrated on the US. It's the US government deficit as a percent of the GDP, that's the red line, plotted against the US unemployment rate, which is the dark brown line. And what you can see there is it looks like a perfect fit. So when the deficit gets deeper, when that red line goes down, that the dark brown line seems to go down with it, and when the deficit is reduced, when the red line goes up, the brown line tends to go up as well. So that looks pretty good, except for one thing. What I've done there is I've inverted the unemployment rate so that it does actually line up with the deficit. So what that's really telling us is, in fact, there's a very strong inverse relationship, at least contemporaneously, between the unemployment rate and the government deficits. In fact, the opposite happens. If you running a high deficit usually happens when the unemployment rate's high, and running a surplus usually happens when the unemployment rate's low. Now, that's not, in fact, the correlation coefficient's 0.72. That's not surprising because, you know, the governments are usually responding with a lag to the developments in the economy, and then once you implement fiscal policy, like you reduce the deficit, there's a bit of a lag until it kicks in and affects the economy. So if I lag the unemployment rate by 3 years, what does that do to that correlation? Well, it lowers that strongly negative correlation, but it doesn't eliminate it. It lowers it to minus 0.23. And I fiddled with a number of lags, and a 3-year lag, which is like really the limit of what you'd think, minimises that correlation, but it's still negative. In other words, the relationship's still going the wrong way. It's really a bad set of data, I believe, for evidence of the potency of fiscal policy. I tried it with GDP, and you get the same sort of result. What about monetary policy? How does that fare over the same time period? And just by the way, the time period I'm looking at is from 1961 through to 2007, so I don't include the GFC, and I'll tell you why I don't do that in a second. There's a lot of rich shocks in the data over that period, so you'd expect there to be plenty of volatility to try and get those correlations happening, which it does. Now, monetary policy in the pre-GFC, that's what you've got on the left-hand side. That's the Fed funds rate plotted against the unemployment rate. And what it shows that interest rates are positively correlated with the unemployment rate. That means when the Fed funds rate rises, the unemployment rate rises, and when the Fed funds rate falls, the unemployment rate falls. Now, the optimal lag structure there is about 8 quarters, about 2 years, so fairly long lags, and the correlation coefficient is moderately positive at about 0.42%. 0.42, I should say. So just on this sort of simple look through, it's hard to find a lot of evidence that fiscal policy is better than monetary policy at controlling the unemployment rate, although this isn't a causation, it's a correlation. It'd be great for someone to go in and really have a look at this in more detail. The next slide, if I may ask you to turn over. Look, the post-GFC, which is really where a lot of the debate of the MMTs comes in, is a really unusual period. And I thought I would test, it doesn't do a lot to those very long correlations that you saw in the previous slide, because it's only about a 10-year period as opposed to a 60-year period in that previous other slide. But you can see the difference it makes. Fiscal policy post-GFC, it really doesn't change the qualitative results. Budgets and the unemployment rate are still negatively correlated. Lagging the data still doesn't alter the qualitative result, but a short sample period really inhibits any long lags. And it's a similar result if you try fiscal policy against GDP. Now, monetary policy, the problem is we can't use interest rates anymore. It's one of the reasons why I separated out the GFC, because interest rates sort of went to zero and there's no volatility in the interest rates. But what was happening is we were getting a lot of monetary stimulus through quantitative easing while interest rates were zero, so that should show up in the money supply. So what you've got there is I've substituted money supply for interest rates, and it shows that there is really very little correlation with the unemployment rate, regardless of lag structure. So over the period of the GFC, neither government spending nor monetary policy seems to have much correlation with the unemployment rate. Next slide, please. What's the evidence? Well, what do experts say? Well, in terms of fiscal policy, there's two commonly cited studies of fiscal efficacy. There's the US Congressional Budget Office that assessed policies that are associated with COVID. The cumulative impact over 4 quarters, according to them, was 1.78. That's a multiplier analysis. What that means is that for every $100 million of fiscal spending that occurred in relationship to the COVID policies of both Trump and Biden, it means that of every $100 million of fiscal policy spending, $178 million worth of final demand was created over a year. The other study that's often cited is a meta-study that was done by the IMF, and it found that spending multipliers in recession over the course of the cycle, that's over 3 years, roughly speaking, average 1.5. In other words, a multiplier of 1.5, not a little bit below the multiplier that the Congressional Budget Office found for the spending packages of COVID. So they are finding a positive and relatively strongly positive relationship between the economy and fiscal policy positive. In terms of monetary policy, there is evidence that conventional monetary policy is potent during the acute phase of financial crises, less so during the recovery phase. There's really little statistical evidence that QE speeds up the recovery from the QFC. It's more that QE and those types of policies that are associated with the government printing money really stop a financial crisis from going from recessionary to depressionary. There's a question over the efficacy of QE, particularly as interest rates approach the zero bound, and that's what everyone's worried about at the moment. Is QE really effective on its own, or is QE only effective insofar as it allows the government to raise spending? So next slide, thanks. There's a couple of things that I don't understand though, and I'll just quickly highlight what they are. Firstly, MMT seems nonchalant, almost dismissive of interest rates, but interest rates on government bonds, I know being in the financial markets, anchors all the yields on assets. Think now of the search for yield as interest rates have gone down. Investors are piling into high risk assets, searching for that yield and collapsing that yield as closer to a yield on the interest rates. If government debt is not repaid, including interest, such that interest rates on government debt falls to zero, I question how investors are going to value assets. What happens if a financial crisis erupts, for example? How is liquidity injected into a financial system to ease financial dislocations a la the GFC? Or are financial crises just a function of poorly orchestrated conventional monetary policy when interest rates are set too low? How would financial markets adjust to such a regime change? Are we in fact seeing that now? Financial markets finding difficulty to price risk. Second point is MMT is relaxed about society's ability to control inflation with fiscal restraint. So MMT points out the government has a monopoly over the money supply, and linking the ability to print money directly to spending is their way of getting the money directly into the economy without the need of debt financing. But that ability to link money directly to spending, in other words, putting the ability to spend without restraint in the hands of politicians, really gives incentives to agents to capture government spending by allowing the government to be free of debt constraints. Debt constraints are typically imposed by the market. In other words, how can we know that the government now has a monopoly over the issuance of funds, money? How is it not captured by vested interest? And how can we be sure that it will tighten fiscal policy and take away money from those vested interests in times of inflation? And the final point is that I think, can it really deal with stagflation? But then again, what can? Next slide. So weighing it up, and then I'll conclude my presentation, throw it open for questions. Look, the pros and cons of modern monetary theory. My question is, are we in a world of convergence, or are we in a world of divergence in terms of that theory and what's currently happening in reality in both fiscal and monetary policy? If I look to central bankers, they, to a man, are united against modern monetary theory. You can see why, because it really reduces their role to one of an accountant, in effect. The role's critically important because it creates money in the economy, but basically it is really not a policy maker per se. And if you look at Phil Lowe, he's famous for the following quote: "Modern monetary theory is neither modern or monetary or theory," so very dismissive. When you look at financial markets, they're a bit mixed, I would say. If you look at somebody who's coming over to the monetary theorist's point of view, it's Ray Dalio from Bridgewater. Bridgewater, of course, is the biggest hedge fund in the world. And I've got a quote of his there that fiscal policy has to be connected with monetary policy. In other words, the argument is that, yes, we do need to fund or finance fiscal spending out of out of monetary policy at the moment, because monetary policy is based on moving interest rates. In most cases, they've been unable to happen alone or unable to happen much, particularly when interest rates are at zero. And monetary policy based on central banks printing money, that is just QE without tying it to government expenditure, just buying financial assets. Not only does it have limited power to stimulate when interest rates are zero, it's very unequitable, because by bidding up assets, it favours wealth holders who tend to be wealthy people. That's Ray Dalio. So finally, what do I see as the pros? Well, despite my attempt at exposition, at some level, modern monetary theory is easy to understand. The government doesn't have to pay off its debt. It just prints money. It finances its spending to get that money into the economy. That is usually an effective way of stimulating the economy. So let's not muck around. Let's eradicate unemployment by spending money and having the central bank basically finance it. Don't worry about the debt, because the central bank will never collect it. It gives an alternative approach when recent experience of current policies have issues. And it sounds equitable compared to QE that favours the wealthy. In terms of the cons, if QE with zero interest rates funding government deficits is something like MMT. Do we need all the other contentious elements of MMT, such as guarantees for jobs, the loss of independence by the central bank, for example? How would a transition be managed to MMT that wouldn't cause mayhem in financial markets? I know now if that was to happen, attempt to happen quickly, financial markets would go into an absolute meltdown. What happens if governments abuse the allure of no budget constraint? That's the point I made before. And what happens to our currency if we adopt MMT? It's all right for the US to be discussing MMT that has its currency has a reserve currency status, but Australia doesn't. If we were to all of a sudden ignore government indebtedness and the ratings agents would downgrade us, we need to pay a premium on foreign funding. And whilst we do issue all of our debt in domestic currency, we issue a hell of a lot of debt in foreign currency via the private sector, and our debt to GDP ratio with the rest of the world is about 60%. So we cannot afford to have international investors lose confidence in our economy. Okay, so that wraps up my part of the presentation. So back to you, Chris, and open for any questions.
Thanks very much for that, Matthew. That was great, very informative. I guess before the presentation, we were sort of talking about one of the difficulties that economists face is that they often have to rely on natural experiments, I guess, to assess the effectiveness of different theories. And I suppose MMT is no different in that regard. Are there any historical precedents that you think are particularly instructive when it comes to MMT? For example, I often hear Japan being mentioned as an example of MMT, I suppose, in practice. Are there any particular examples that you tend to refer to?
Well, I think you're right there, Chris. I mean, a lot of the emphasis has been on the last decade, and there's a lot wrapped up in that post-GFC period. It was a financial crisis, and who knows how to unravel that. And it's relatively short period in some sense to be able to conduct such an experiment. Now, Japan's a great example, I think, and we heard Professor Mitchell actually cite Japan as an example of where fiscal policy worked well. The argument that Bill Mitchell put forward was that they had the biggest shock to their financial system with the collapse in their property prices, property valuations that had been seen basically ever. They only had one quarter of negative growth, and Bill slated that home to the government doing fiscal stimulus. What's ignored there somewhat is that what followed was 2 decades of no growth, despite the fact that the government debt level accumulated deficits went from something like 60% to 250%. We know there's been no growth. There's been no inflation either. So the question that MMT also poses, Japan has undertaken a lot of quantitative easing, which they claim isn't MMT, yet it has been totally unsuccessful in generating higher inflation. So I think there's a really strong story line there in Japan, a really good place to conduct analysis. MMT is a sort of claim part of a success, part of it not a success. The mainstream economists point to it as a situation where it refutes MMT. I think the other period that really is ignored for some reason in the analysis that I've looked at, or the commentary that I've looked at, is the period of high inflation rates. So MMT is sort of, it seems to me, think that the period of the 60s was the halcyon days when monetary policy reigned supreme, and of course we had full employment. And then once fiscal policy reigned supreme. We had full employment in the 60s. And then it came in the 70s when Friedman and the nasty monetary policy advocates got control, that, you know, everything went haywire. Whereas I think, you know, most people's reading of it is that it was a move to really, you know, as government budgets blew out and debt levels started to rise, and as the central banks lost control of the money supply by actually, you know, printing too much money, in effect, it was really, that led to the breakout of inflation, along with a fourfold increase in oil prices. But it was reinforced by policy, both fiscal policy trying to avoid the impact of stagflation, and monetary policy similarly trying to avoid that same problem. Then, you know, there was a reaction to that, and a tightening of fiscal policy, tightening of monetary policy, knocking into recession, then that unwound. But the actual key point, I think, of that episode is that inflation expectations clearly went up. So whether, you know, looking at inflation is the right policy objective of monetary and fiscal policy, or inflation expectations is the right policy objective, is part of the key, I think. The problem with measuring, why is that the key? Because there's a lot of volatility in inflation, and headline inflation, we can't really tell whether it's temporary or whether it's permanent, for example, at the moment. What we can tell is that through inflation expectations, largely, whether financial market agents are factoring in whether that's temporary or permanent, and it's that behaviour that they respond to that's going to upset growth and inflation in the economy. So looking at inflation expectations, I think, is a key. The problem is we don't have a pure measure of inflation expectations, and we don't have a pure measure of inflation expectations, particularly back in that 70s period, because of the lack of financial instruments to infer inflation expectations. But they're two sort of key areas where I think, you know, like, wow, in the 70s we had really explosive fiscal policy and monetary policy, and we had high inflation. That must have something, some kernel of nugget of truth in it. And then the episode of the lost 2 decades of Japan, the opposite, where no inflation, no growth, yet massive fiscal policy and monetary stimulus. They're two areas, yeah. Yeah,
2 areas that are ripe for the applied economists, I think, to do their research, no doubt. As we were sort of talking, I suppose, about MMT, I guess, relies on governments being able to reduce spending and/or, you know, raise taxes and/or, I guess, introduce regulations, you know, when required, I suppose, to, you know, keep demand-led inflation in check. I was just wondering, you know, how practical do you think that actually is in practice? Do you think it's a risk that governments, you know, might be unable or unwilling, I suppose, to act quickly enough, I suppose, to you know, avert the risk of hyperinflation when, you know, when it's required?
Well, that's the obvious, you know, the obvious risk that everyone cites. And so what's the comeback to that? Well, the MMTs would say, well, there's exactly the same risk with monetary policy. Effectively, yeah, sure, central banks are independent in some notional sense from the government, but the reality is the government, you know, the central banks are part of government. They do, you know, most central banks, governments have the ability to sack the heads of the central bank, appoint new heads of central bank, and even change their mandates if they want to. So, you know, they would argue that central banks aren't that. But anyway, leaving that aside, the main issue is exactly what you say, you know, like, what are the other countervailing incentives that impose pinch on politicians to avoid the discipline that's required to move fiscal policy as a counter-inflationary or counter-cyclical tool? And I suppose the point I was trying to make is that it's a point that the MMTs make. They point out that the government is a monopolist over the money supply, over the currency. And in a way, if you think about that, if you say, right, so government spending then can be funded by this monopoly power, no sort of cost or no cost to debt, basically. And you take away a really significant, in my opinion, discipline on government spending, or politicians' government spending, which is the market's response to really high levels of deficit and high levels of inflation. You know, like they really punish governments, you know, by achieving too high levels of debt before that debt can, and that spending and that deficit can lead to hyperinflation. And what's the incentive? Well, you know, you've got a monopoly. So there's always, whenever there's a monopoly, there's rents to be had. So, you know, we know that there are, you know, agents are bidding for government funding all the time. There's an incentive for them to have that funding for their own rent. And, you know, the question would be, you know, if those who support, you know, the government is presumably giving those or meeting some of those requests by their agents who are supporting them politically, would they be able to exit from them easily in the face of inflation? The answer is probably, my guess is probably not.
Mm. Yeah. A question from the audience here, Matthew. So, how do MMT advocates overcome the inevitable consequence of the devaluation of currency? Currency only has value due to limited supply, but if we're printing unlimited amounts, doesn't that devalue the currency and create hyperinflation?
Yeah, well, the MMT is a completely demand side focused, right? So their view is that, you know, what would happen is by printing of money, you would be increasing, say in an open economy, the demand for imports. Some of that would be leaked out into the demand for imports. That would tend to put down, and also by and that would tend to put downward pressure on the exchange rate, certainly, which would potentially stimulate exports as well. If that devaluation, so in terms of so in terms of the balance of payments, it's not necessarily clear from the MMT is what it does. But if it was to lead to a devaluation of the currency, to the extent that that fed into inflation domestically, then the MMT response would be that you pull back on the deficit, you pull back on spending. So for them, it all comes back to you know, inflation. So if that source of inflation is coming from too rapid a devaluation of the currency, then you would pull back on the deficit spending. But
okay,
you know, where does that impetus come from? Effectively, it comes from, you know, the demand for goods and services.
Yeah. Just wondering, Matthew, like, how do, I guess, the continuing, you know, rapid advances in technology, I guess, play into all this, I suppose, and in particular, I guess, you know, the full employment rate and I guess the risks of inflation. You know, to some extent, do you think that might, you know, explain some of the divergence that you were sort of showing, you know, post the GFC, you know, between, you know, fiscal and monetary policy and the impact on unemployment levels?
Yeah, well, it's one of the key issues that we're facing at the moment, and there's the question of how MMT views that, and I don't know if I can give a very coherent rendition of what they think, but in terms of what the paradox is that we have seen acceleration of labour-saving technological change, you know, through the advent of digital economy in particular, and usually that increase in technology leads to an increase in economic growth, an increase in labour productivity as well. But when you look at measured labour productivity, it's actually fallen and it's very weak in the post-GFC periods. If you look at Australia, for example, in the 2 decades leading up to the GFC, measured labour productivity growth was averaging about 2% per annum. Post GFC, that's halved to 1%. Notwithstanding all of this, new technology that we have. So how do you reconcile those two issues is a big debate at the moment. Question, and I don't really have time. I don't sort of want to go through it at the moment, but the question is that we need to be able to really enhance businesses' ability to do investment expenditure and adopt more quickly the new technologies at the same, and enable businesses to enjoy the profits that stem from those new technologies, expand output through that improvement in profits as they chase, as businesses chase profits, and that to increase employment. So it's very difficult for businesses to really accelerate the rate of employment, the rate of production, when productivity is so weak, because they just don't have the margins to be able to really justify high levels of investment, particularly under an uncertain environment. So that's a sort of like consistent with the MMT viewpoint that businesses are unwilling to invest when there's uncertainty, and lower interest rates don't help that much. I would argue that's right. I would also argue that increasing their profitability potentially through improved access and adoption of technological labour-saving technological change, but at the same time giving incentives to be able to increase production and hence employ more workers is also important. That's where fiscal policy comes in. So to try and get that technology into the marketplace without it being used to just sort of save on the labour force costs is one of the key issues that we have going forward. And maybe some of the lessons of MMT are relevant there in terms of the government's role in stimulating the economy to get that happening.
I think we probably have time just for one more question, Matthew, before we let you go. It seems like a lot of central bankers and economists are loath to admit that MMT might have any role, I guess, to play in setting economic policy here in Australia. But as you were kind of indicating during the course of your presentation, given the RBA is currently buying a lot of the Australian government's debt at the moment, I think I read somewhere that it's well more than 90%, I think, of the bonds that they're currently issuing. Do you think, I guess, MMT appears to already be having a real world impact on our economic policy decision making here in Australia, and what other elements or tenets of MMT do you sort of see potentially making their way into economic policy in the years to come?
Well, I don't know if it's been the influence of MMT that's led to the current situation, or whether it's just the policy options have been closed off, and so this is the last sort of policy option that exists. The Reserve Bank certainly wouldn't admit that they were doing MMT, and the big distinction they would draw is that they are not coordinating the policy with the government. They're not actually sitting down with the government. Like my point of my little example at the start was effectively the way it works. It starts with the government wanting to spend, instructing the central bank to provide funds for that to happen. That's how it works. Whereas the central banks now are doing quantitative easing to try and to keep interest, the long end of the curve flat, and long end of the curve, long end interest rates down, and also trying to stimulate the economy through injecting liquidity to enhance lending. But in my opinion, if it looks like MMT and it smells like MMT, it is MMT.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment it is. For whatever reason we've got to this point, it is. The difference is, without all the other elements to MMT going along, you can always go back to conventional policy making. If you go down the route of the MMT world, it's going to be very hard to unwind that. And also, you don't have to announce to financial markets, oh, that's it, independence of central banks is now truly finished. The government debt will just be, can be paid off just by printing more money. But that's a big difference if you went that route. I can tell you right now, there would be mayhem in financial markets if we were to announce that. It may happen by stealth over time, but it would take a long time. It's not happening now. But policy right now looks to me like MMT.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for your time. That was a fantastic presentation and great speaking with you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye.